Following on from my video on the origins of the American Hunt Association that I did about a year ago now, I wanted to return to the disturbing world of Hunt Showdown, and this also means the return of Mrs. Wisefish to research and write this video for me to read and edit.
He's back!
I have wanted for some time to look into the origins of every monster found in Hunt Showdown, and I thought we would start by looking into the Butcher, who intrigues me the most. After Mrs. Wisefish sat down with the evidence, she told me that we can't do the Butcher without also doing the Meathead, as the two stories are intertwined and essential to understanding each other. And indeed, it is better to start with the Meathead. Anyone who has entered the world of Hunt Showdown will know that the Meathead, being called the Meathead, is one of the strangest things about it, in so much as it does not have a head at all. Therefore, the Meathead itself does not have the ability to see, hear, or smell us in an ordinary way. Instead, it uses the leeches found on top of its shoulders to seek out its prey and subdue them with their poisonous bites. The Meathead, as the researcher points out, is in physical appearance obviously related to the Meathead, what with its huge size and the presence of leeches, but the Butcher has some additions that make it distinct. Specifically, the Butcher has a head, albeit the head of a pig, set atop its leeches. Furthermore, it has branches and spikes of wire that stick out of its body, a flaming hook it uses as its weapon, and an apron that the researcher believes makes it flameproof. But where did these awful creatures come from, and what can be gleaned about them from the Book of Monsters? Let's get into the evidence and see what we can find on these horrific creatures, especially the Butcher, who by the looks of that apron would cook you if they were to find you in their lair and turn you into a tasty meal. And speaking of cooking, that brings us onto today's sponsor, who is much more appealing to the eye and far tastier, that being Factor. Factor is a quick meal service which consists of extremely nutritional dietitian approved meals right to your doorstep, containing fully organic ingredients for some incredibly tasty breakfasts, lunches and dinners. If you're like me and you're just permanently busy this summer, be that a new parent like myself or just out and about with friends and family on holiday, Factor meals are super quick and easy to make in just 2 minutes, and they give you over 35 options of meals on the menu, working hand in hand with any diet you might be on as well. The other bonus to these meals is they are also fully fresh and never frozen, meaning you are getting the best quality meal possible. There are also a lot of tasty breakfast options, ranging from smoothies, which I'm always partial to at breakfast, juices, small bites, and so much more. So you are completely sorted for everything, allowing you to focus on your day ahead. So if you want some amazing meals for your busy summer, head over to factor75.com or use the link in the description below and use code WISEFISH50 to get 50% off your first subscription box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's WISEFISH50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month of orders. A big thanks to Factor for sponsoring this video, and with that said, let's get back to a more gruesome topic, that being the terrifying Butcher from Hunt Showdown. The researcher for the Meathead evidence starts with an account by Tamrex Scognomilio, most likely associated with the American Hunt Association, judging by his insight into the legends of the Meathead. According to him, the Meathead was a soul farmer and would creep into the towns by night to harvest the souls of his unsuspecting victims. The researcher is skeptical of this account, as the Meathead is, in his opinion, too large to fit through the average doorway and has no mouth with which to devour anything. Nonetheless, he has compiled much evidence about this creature, most of it courtesy of a William Salter, who stole the notes by accident from the asylum run by the leader of the American Hunters Association, Dr. Philip Huff Jones. What Salter finds in these records causes him great distress and fear. He is barely able to write about what he found. This evidence tells us everything we need to know about how the Meathead was created and how the hunters may have brought their greatest enemy upon themselves. The account starts before the events of 1895, going back to the beginnings of the American Hunters Association. Early on, both men and women were allowed to be initiated into the association, but their participation had to end after it was found that one of them was pregnant, and owing to the nature of how one is initiated into the American Hunters Association, her condition was extremely dangerous. The women showed increasing power power throughout her pregnancy, and when the child was born, it was described as being more like a demon. The mother did not survive, and the monster took out 12 hunters before it too reached its demise. From then on, no woman was allowed to be initiated until the problems with the initiation serum could be rectified. This was until a hunter by the name of Jonathan Kinney broke his vow of secrecy to the American Hunters Association and told his wife, Hannah, everything about the monsters, as well as the plague and what it was to be a hunter. In secret, they performed the initiation ritual, and together they became some of the most successful hunters in the society's history. Soon as Mrs. Kenny started showing vicious displays of power, and according to a friend of the couple, could destroy an entire horde herself with a wrath, a fury, and a joy that I fear to recall. This friend urged Jonathan to confess his wife's condition to the other hunters, but he refused and was never seen again. When in January 1895, the time came for Hannah to give birth, therefore no hunters could be ready and prepared for what was to come. There was only one doctor in attendance at the birth, and he described it thus: her eyes glowed and her skin steamed. A grin appeared frozen upon her face, though her moans and screams spoke only of pain, even as the creature clawed its way from her body, disgorging leeches and disemboweling the mother, devouring her flesh as it did. She laughed. I shall never forget that sound as long as I live. We should have burnt the entire building to the ground. The creature that Mrs. Kinney gave birth to was described as being the size of a child that had already reached the age of about 6 or 7. It had no head, and in its place, only a nest of writhing leeches. The doctor fled to get help, but when he returned with reinforcements, the creature was gone. It had run to the swamp to become another monster for the American Hunters Association to hunt. The story of the Kinneys became all the more tragic when Dr. Jones revealed at the end of his account that if they had been honest with him about wanting Hannah to join the society, he could have told them that the serum had been perfected and was no longer a risk to women. But what Dr. Jones didn't know at this point is that the Kinneys had not just created the Meathead, they had also laid the path for the creation of the Butcher as well. From here, we move on to the story of Mr. Ariel Dornoy, a taxidermist who was perhaps a bit too obsessed with his art, for want of a better word. At first, in July 1893, he advertises in the New Orleans True Crescent an exhibition comprising photos of Walter Potter, the famous English taxidermist who made anthropomorphic displays of stuffed animals such as the kitten's tea party, the guinea pig's cricket match, and the rabbits studying at school. In September of the same year, Ariel advertised again within the Crescent, this time for an exhibition from Barnum's American Museum. Now don't let Hollywood deceive you, this was no place of acceptance and empowerment, but an exploitative money-making scheme filled with tricks and hoaxes. One of the most famous of these, and certainly of interest to Ariel, was the Fiji mermaid, the stuffed head and body of a monkey attached to the tail of a fish. Finally, in June 1894, Ariel Dornoy advertised his own taxidermy business, setting himself up as providing a service for those who wished to preserve a beloved family pet. He had set himself up in a house, which would also serve as his business premises, living next door to Mrs. Florence Frank, who offered him her family well wishes at his arrival, and was in turn offered a tour of his shop that he was just setting up. Mrs. Frank was horrified that his wares included racks of skins and rows of fine sharp knives and other tools that were unknown to her. Immediately she felt that her new neighbor was not to be trusted. Her mistrust of Mr. Dornoy was reinforced when she learned that instead of stuffing the dead animals as was normal for taxidermy, he was actually creating clay models, and then he was stretching the skins over them like a coat. Mrs. Frank and her husband were deeply concerned over what they saw as obvious devilry, and they encouraged their good Christian neighbors to make it clear to him that he and his trade were not welcome in their neighborhood. Soon after, the plague reached where they lived, and of course Mrs. Frank felt that this was punishment from God for Mr. Dornoy's unnatural work. The next thing she knew was that Ariel had had disappeared. We caught up with him on March 4th, 1895, just after he had fled. Of course, he has a different view of his work. He argues that his preservation of animals is to show appreciation and to celebrate their lives, not as an obsession with death. However, he does admit that at first he was not as good a taxidermist as he would have liked to have been. He particularly struggled to create good eyes, and even he had to admit they did have an unfortunately demonic look, and at one point a customer of his actually fainted when presented with her pet and ordered Mr. Denoy to take it away and burn it. As far as he is concerned, he is a victim of a witch hunt orchestrated by his neighbour Mrs. Frank, and he muses briefly on when her children inevitably succumb to the plague that perhaps he should stuff them to teach her a lesson. But he catches himself immediately. He has never even killed an animal. He does not believe himself capable of preserving a human child. The next day he finds shelter in an abandoned slaughterhouse. He finds comfort in a strange way, as in one room he finds several pig carcasses that have been left hanging, just like the skins he kept hanging up in his home. On further exploration of the slaughterhouse, he speaks vaguely of the previous occupants having had a similar passion to himself, although he finds it more gruesome and hopes that he never encounters who dwelt there before him. Resigning himself to staying for a while in an abandoned slaughterhouse, he starts to make plans for his survival. He realizes that he will have to learn to hunt in order to be able to eat anything. Ariel dislikes hunting, but believes that by preserving the animals he kills, he would be honoring their lives in some small way. He decides to get some practice on the pig carcasses that have been left behind and starts preparing one of their heads for some future use. Soon after Ariel was trying his luck at hunting small game for something to eat, he would come across the carcass of some enormous beast. In his own words, he describes this creature as being over 6 feet tall, at least 350 pounds. Its flesh was soft, mealy and pale, and its shoulder a well of leeches, now dead but clearly not an addition to, but part of the body. And the detail that horrified him the most was that the creature had no head. Not a head that had been removed, a body naturally formed without that appendage. Ariel was not a member of the American Hunters Association, so it was unknown to him that he had not stumbled upon some anomaly of the natural world, but the synthesized monster that had so recently devoured its mother, Hannah Kinney, the Meathead. He was shaken initially at the sight of something so grotesque and unnatural, but as his horror began to subside, an idea took root inside his mind. He was, after all, a taxidermist. Could this specimen be his route to find his own fame in his field, alongside that of Walter Potter, and to be marveled at like the exhibitions at Barnum's American Museum? His greatest dreams were realized, and the promise of becoming a rich man, his name known across the world. Immediately he set to work. After finding some rope, he used all of his strength to be able to hoist the gigantic body of the meathead onto a small wagon, and he then transported it back to his new slaughterhouse home. As soon as he returned, he immediately saw to the task of skinning the monster. The skin, however, was tougher than he had expected, as thick as an elephant he surmised, and inside he found the organ of the meathead was as unnatural as its appearance, but he found the process much easier without it having a brain or eyes to remove. And at the very least, he would not encounter his usual problem of only being able to create demonic appearing eyes. The leeches, he felt, would be easier to stretch across their simple clay form due to their tough carapace, but the creature itself would take a lot of work to form. Ariel, however, was unfettered and dedicated himself to this laborious task with much enthusiasm. Ariel's enthusiasm, however, was leading to impatience. The skin of the meathead was taking a long time to dry out, stalling his work and leaving him at a loose end. In his boredom, he decided to wander back into town for a drink and to catch up on news. He learned then that the plague had worsened and found that corpses were being piled up in the streets. This confirmed to him that staying at the slaughterhouse to see his project through to the end was the safest course for him to take to avoid what he felt was a likely chance of death in town. At last, over a week after he started his task, the skin of the meathead had dried out enough so as to be stretched over its new clay innards. With its large size, Ariel had to find new ways of holding the beast together. He found wire to wrap around it and attach branches to the body in order to hold it upright. Despite its patched up state, Ariel can only see that this will be the masterpiece of his career, and this is where he will get his money, all thanks to its fearsome appearance. The following day, Ariel was relieved to find that it had stayed together through the night and now saw to the finishing touches. His attempts to cut through the meathead's tough skin had left ugly scars on the creature's torso, so in order to cover this up, he wrapped his own taxidermist's apron around the meathead. Feeling at this point that he had done as much as he could, all he had to do now was wait for his work to set, and with his free time, he investigated the slaughterhouse further. He found the place to be in a dismal state and found in one of the storerooms a large quantity of salted meat, long gone bad, but served its purpose in staying his hunger and delaying the need to go hunting once again. Despite his poor circumstances at this time, Ariel can't help but still feel that he was lucky to have ended up where he was, with the one-of-a-kind meathead almost ready to display and being in the perfect place to bring his vision to life. Later that night though, he would hear what he described as horrible noises. What those horrible noises were, we never found out, but even though they unsettled him, he was able to sleep nonetheless. After some reflection, Ariel decides that his creature will not be complete without a head, and so finding the head of the pig that he had worked on when he first arrived at the slaughterhouse, he attached it to the stuffed carcass of the meathead. Ariel had already found the creature to be monstrous, but with the pig's head, he felt it had become truly horrific. His next task, however, was to figure out how to transport it into town for display. However, before he can make any plans, a storm rolls in and causes the roof in his sleeping quarters to partially collapse. Lacking the bed to sleep in for the night, Ariel decides to sleep in the workshop where the augmented meathead remained, propped up with sticks and held together by an apron, with its new pig's head sewn into its leech-ridden shoulders. This is the last time we know of Ariel Dornoy being alive. On March 31st, less than a month after Ariel fled the accusations of his neighbor and found his fateful shelter in the slaughterhouse, his body was discovered by a group of fishermen on the road to Stillwater Bayou. To the investigators, his discovery in this location made little sense, and they had the further mystery as to how his remains were in such a poor condition. The only way they could identify that the body did indeed belong to Ariel Dornoy was that a demonic glass eye was found on his persons. Mrs. Frank, on learning of his death, commented on the situation, stating God had delivered his punishment. Here the story of Ariel Dornoy and his unintentional creation of the butcher from the carcass of the meathead ends. However, the researcher gives us one more piece of evidence. As any hunters will know, the butcher is immune to fire, and actually the researcher theorized that this is due to it wearing an apron, but they seem to have overlooked an article that they themselves contributed. The article is in reference to the Great Fire in Algiers, which devastated the New Orleans adjacent town, destroying just under 200 homes over 10 blocks and rendering 1,200 people homeless. Within the wreckage, a firefighter was sifting through debris and discovered one inhabitant's collection of taxidermied pets, which had survived the fire completely unscathed. We learn here that the chemicals used in the preservation process made the creatures completely fireproof. And here, I think we have that last piece of evidence that makes the butcher make sense as much as it can. The preservation techniques used by Ariel Dornoy gave the butcher one of its greatest strengths and made the job a lot harder for the hunters. Now the year is 1895 going into 1896, and the butcher still roams its lair, with its siblings the meatheads lurking outside of once populated areas. The butcher's appearance has certainly made history, but not for good reasons, as hunters from all over the country and the world seek it out to claim its kill for themselves. But with it being so heavily armored and fire resistant, this would not be an easy task, and many many would be lost in the process. And even if they were to take out this horrific creature, there are still many more monsters out there whose origins we will explore at another time. For now though, this has been the dark mystery behind the creature known as the Butcher, as well as all of the headless siblings of it, known as the Meatheads. So there we go, the story of how the hunters unwittingly created first the Meathead, and by consequence the Butcher as well. To summarize, taxidermy gives both myself and Mrs. Wisefish the absolute creeps, as it just seems a bit unnatural in our opinion anyway. But that said, Mrs. Wisefish does have a soft spot for the disaster that is the Gripsholm lion, so as a special treat for those of you here at the end, here's a photo for you to enjoy. Look at that cheeky grin, what a lad. Thank you all so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed this look into the monsters of Hunt Showdown and enjoy the massive update the game has, pushing us into 1896. We will go on to explore all of the other monsters in later videos, as well as the new events coming up such as the Scorched Earth one, which intrigues me a lot, so stay subscribed if you want to watch more Hunt content. I want to give a big shout out to my patrons for supporting the channel, including my small fishes, my big fishes, Greg and Knoxfox, my YouTube channel Wise Ones, Sith Lord 906, Video Gamer 75 and RIP City, my sharks, Jason X117, Alfred Correa and Nia Park, and my massive megalodons, Sinus and Hazy Thoughts. Also a massive thank you to Factor for sponsoring this video. Remember code WISEFISH50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first order and 20% on the orders after that. And with all of that said, a big thank you once again for watching, and I shall see you all in the next one. Cheers.